stay one step ahead of a technical issue here. I'll be
Okay.
back with my laptop. But
So
it's
we-
recording.
As I said, go right
I'll just
ahead.
quietly come back.
Walk in and out.
Okay. Okay, well, so Manon, I understand you have a long-standing history with David Hawkins, and I'm here to learn more about how you met him.
I wish I could tell you how I met him. I don't exactly remember, as I said, except that I'm pretty sure it was in 1966 when I was moving to Colorado. He was moving to Colorado, and we were doing this major workshop with the Cleveland Public Schools. And he was back of it. He was the one that got the idea, and my friend David Armington from Hawkins School was running the thing, and
So David Hawkins, I'm gonna say this for clarity purposes, coincidentally, you worked for the Hawkins School in Cleveland.
yeah,
But that had
and
no
no, it has no
connection.
connection whatsoever.
David
It's just
Hawkins.
a very exclusive private school for boys in Cleveland, and I was there for 7 years, and it was a great school. I loved it.
And so you had heard about David Hawkins, and he was coming to Cleveland
Yes,
to do a big workshop for Cleveland teachers.
Yep.
Just coincidentally.
yep,
Okay.
that's what I remember.
Okay.
And,
That's good enough.
And so then, when, of course, when he moved to Colorado, and so did I, and he set up Mountain View Center, I used to go up to the center quite a lot. Ah. At the time, he hadn't set up, I mean, he was in 3 different locations at the University of Colorado after that, and he invited teachers, of course, to come to the center, and so a whole bunch of us from Colorado Academy's lower school used to go up probably once a week or once every 2 weeks and just mess about in David's teacher center. And
His teacher center was at the Mountain View Center?
it was
in Boulder?
at the university. The first place that I remember that it was located was up in a ceiling, up in an attic room, and it was just full of everything that you could want to play with. And so, as I said, the group of us from Colorado Academy Lower School used to go up and just play once a week or once every 2 weeks or 3 weeks. David just invited us to come. And I remember walking in one night, and he said, David said, "Wouldn't somebody like me to teach him something? I haven't taught anybody anything in years." And so I said, "Yes, teach me how to make a balance beam."
And did he?
Yes, he did. Because as I recall, now I may be totally wrong here, but the professional balance beams that you buy, they always start with one closest to the center, 2, 3, 4. I wanted to start with one out on the edge. And he said, "Why is it mathematicians always want to start out at the outer edge?" And he said, "Physicists always start in the center." But he did teach me how to make my own balance beams that I could work with the kids. And it was, as I said, it was just fun to be up there and play around. And of course, I can't remember when that first article of his came out that was messing about with science.
Mm-hmm. It's in his
It
book
was,
here.
yeah, it's a great one. That one and the I Thou It one.
Also,
Yeah. We all at the Colorado Academy thought he was just a god to us as far as we were concerned. And we had an awful lot of fun those first couple of years that we did that. And then he moved over into another building, and we still continued to go up fairly frequently and just play around And then, of course, would bring ideas back that we could use in our classrooms. And it was a very close-knit lower school. There was just, one class of each grade level.
Is this Mountain View Center or Colorado?
This was Mountain View Center
Mountain View Center,
that he
okay. That he
started,
with
yeah.
Fanny.
But they were at, of course, the university housed them. And so he finally ended up in a very nice building and had a whole floor. And as I recall David saying that they had something like 80 to 90% of the Ford Foundation's money available to run their center, which was nice because he deserved it. He had a wonderful, wonderful staff. And of course, the funny thing is Tony Callett was a musician. And of course, there wasn't much Tony couldn't do. He could do mathematics, he could do science, he could do a lot of things. But when he finally ended up at Mountain View Center with David, he was primarily their music person. And of course, he had the entire Orff instruments, and he did a lot of Orff workshops for teachers around there, and coordinated it nicely with science, coordinated it with mathematics. In fact, Tony was the one that got me interested in using Cuisenaire rods to teach rhythm. And so that was one of the things that I got very interested, because I am still convinced, Susan, that if we could convince teachers, if we could get kindergarten, first grade, second grade teachers to teach rhythm with rods, children wouldn't have the problem with fractions when they come to third, fourth, fifth grade. It would come very naturally to them. But as I said, I'm almost to the point where I'm not sure it's possible. I'm not sure that you can get teachers to do that. I hear too many times, I can't do that. I have to follow the curriculum. I have to do this. I have to do that. They haven't the freedom to try things. And of course, you don't use Cuisenaire rods without learning an awful lot. Or I should say, you have to learn an awful lot to be effective with Cuisenaire rods. Mm-hmm. And I don't find that teachers want to take the time to learn them that effectively.
I would agree with you, and I've been told recently that yet again we're in for a new change called Common Core. The Common Core standards are unrolling as we speak in language arts and in math, and it's going to apparently give people more flexibility to do their teaching in depth rather than superficially, and take them out of the lockstep that some of the curriculum has required. But I think those of us who've seen this circle come round before, I speculate that teachers don't take the time to learn how to do any more than they have to.
Yep.
And I'm afraid
Unfortunately.
that's sad.
But I also one of the key things I remember, I got to work with David Hawkins up at the center up at Mountain View for 3 months one spring. I had been teaching, I'd been a teaching assistant down at UNM, and David called me and asked me if I could come up and spend the last 3 months of the school year at Mountain View. And so it was all right with UNM. They didn't mind my leaving. And so I had a wonderful 3 months up there in the center, working with Boulder teachers and of course working with the Mountain View staff and David and Franny and there was a lady who did art whose first name was Jane. I can't think of her last name. Who also died of cancer, whose husband was working at the lab during the, but anyhow, it was an incredible time for me. And
When was that, do you remember?
oh
70s?
golly, it would have to be late 70s, sometime in there.
I'm sorry,
And I
didn't
remember
hear that.
teachers coming in. David had sort of a group session that teachers just would come to once a week, and they could talk about their problems in the Boulder schools and what they would really like to do. And they came in bitterly complaining about having to do the standardized tests, and that the kids, it didn't really show what the kids knew, it showed what they didn't know. And they spent most of the afternoon pretty much bitching about having to do these standardized tests. And David sat there very quietly listening, and all of a sudden he popped up and he said, "Okay, I've heard your complaints. Now, what are you going to do about it? Are you going to just complain, or are you going to think about something that you could do about it?" And that kind of shocked them. They weren't, too sure about, what was going on here. And David said, "Did you ever stop to think that it's illegal for schools to test children without the parents' permission?" And of course, that hadn't occurred to them. And he said, "Well, why don't you think about getting a letter out to parents, asking them to write the school district and tell them that they can't test their child? Because if a whole bunch of parents say you can't test our children, that the school district can't afford to buy these tests. They have to be able to, afford to pay for this whole school." So I guess that's what they did eventually, and whatever happened after that, I don't know, because I was only there for 3 months. But I thought, as I said, it was a very interesting afternoon. And the very fact that David sat there very quietly, never saying a word, just listening to the teachers, and then coming up with, what are you going to do about it, or are you going to just complain? Because that's what we tended to do,
That says a lot
always
about who he was.
is tend to complain, and of course. Franny was one of the instigators of Head Start. She was one of
Franny
the,
Hawkins was his wife and a kindergarten teacher.
yeah, and as I said, she was one of the first people to get involved with getting Head Start started. And again, I've never known two people who knew more about teaching children and what children could do and what children ought to be doing than these two. They were absolutely amazing people. And as I said, both of them were just like gods to me. And my last year at Colorado Academy, we did a Friday session where the kids could choose something that they wanted. We offered various courses and short courses and stuff. And what I did was ask David if I could bring 5th and 6th graders up to the center and just turn them loose in Mountain View and just watch them, see what they'd go for, see what they'd do. So for 3 months, I would drive maybe half a dozen 5th and 6th graders up to the center, and David would be there, and we'd just observe and watch and see what the kids would get involved in. And of course, there was a music room, there was an art room, there was a science room, there was just everything available to the kids. And some of them just stuck with one thing. I mean, they'd go straight to science or straight to art or straight to Tony and music, and spend their whole morning just, messing about with whatever they were doing. But it was just so interesting to be able to observe children doing what they wanted to do of a morning, and
Easy access to everything.
yeah, exactly.
It leads me back to a question I have. When you said that you would go to Mountain View to play, play is really the key word when you read a lot of David Hawkins' work, and certainly the term messing about, which I was introduced to in, I believe it was the mid-70s when I met Kathy Jervis, and she had just come from Shady Hill and had been working with similar people. And I don't know if David Hawkins was at Shady Hill.
I don't think David was ever there, but I think David had a lot to do with what happened at Shady Hill, because I know that that's where Tony met him.
Okay.
And as I said, Tony was an apprentice at Shady Hill.
So
And-
if you would talk more about play and how he saw it, because that's how he trained teachers the same way he worked with kids.
Mm-hmm, exactly.
He offered them the same opportunities.
He had the materials there, and just encouraged you to sit down and mess about with them and see what you could find out, see what interested you, see what interested the kids, you know.
Did he ever have an overarching objective that this afternoon we were going to try to build balance beams?
I'm sure that he might have, but he never interfered, never intruded into what you wanted to do. It was your time and it was your place, and you could do whatever it is that you wanted to do. I don't recall that he ever, other than the fact that one night when he said, "Wouldn't somebody like me to teach them something I haven't taught in a long time?" that was a shock, because we hadn't even thought about David as a quote teacher. He was a guide. He was a mentor. He was someone who introduced you to things, who showed you different things, but he never interfered, as I said, with what it was that you wanted to do. And Franny was the same way. And anytime Franny was around, it was always, well, they were both interested. I used to sometimes take ideas up that I was dealing with children at Colorado Academy that maybe had some problems, or maybe I didn't understand what they were getting into or whatnot. I could take problems like that up to the center and talk to David or Franny or whoever involved, and they would give me ideas on perhaps what would happen. In fact, when we first started, that I was one of the original founders of Rio Grande School, only it wasn't Rio Grande at the time. And we called it the Learning Center School. And we had a little boy in that school who was 5 years old. And he was in our 5, 6, and 7-year-old classroom. And he spent most of his time just wandering. He wasn't interested in any of the materials. He wasn't interested in listening to stories or anything like that. And I called Franny and asked her if she would come down and spend 3 or 4 days with us and watch him and see what she thought might possibly be the problem, which she did. She was willing to come down and spend time, and it turned out that there were problems that that we really weren't equipped to handle. And but any child that was in trouble, they were willing to talk about. They were willing to try to help if they possibly could. And of course, then we also had David come down and speak at the various Colorado independent school meetings. However, he was not a popular speaker because he didn't hold the line of what independent school stood for. Well, I remember one, we had a scheduled meeting in Colorado Springs, and we had been asked who we'd like to have come and be our featured speaker. And I asked for John Holt, because I'd known John for years, and I found him extremely interesting as a speaker, and they did ask him, and then because there was so much complaint about the fact that he was this way out person who, you know, didn't again adhere to the kind of curriculum and so forth that private schools stood for, they uninvited him, which I thought was a pretty lousy thing to do, but it happened. And as I said, David was not a popular speaker at any of these
So
school
going
meetings.
back to, so he made quite an impression on you, and quite an impression on a lot of teachers, with his skill at offering opportunities for play
Yeah.
and helping steer conversations. What do you recall where we had talked about this earlier, whether he was one of the people who helped create ESS, or was that through his work at ESS, his elementary school study, and that was an early hands-on science curriculum that was
Yep.
developed in the early 70s with Bruner. Well, Bruner was, I think Bruner was part of it, but I'm also mixing him up with Manic Course of Study,
Yep.
which Bruner did.
Yep.
I didn't know which came first, EDC, Educational Development Centers, or the curriculum that I'm describing. Do you know?
I don't know which came first.
Okay.
I really don't.
But he was part of.
But I do know that I said they were using. Excuse me, I've got to get my various public and private schools as places to try out all the early science, hands-on science curriculum, and we were one of them at Hawkins School in Cleveland, and I remember, as I said, at that point, hearing about David and reading all of the things that I could get a hold of that he had written, and finding that, I mean, that my feelings about children and how they learn coordinated with what David felt about children. And I was lucky enough to be in a school that allowed me to the freedom to teach the way I wanted to teach. I did not have in fact, when I went to the Hawkins School, Susan, our headmaster had just thrown out every textbook in the place and asked teachers to create their own curriculum.
That's Hawkins in Cleveland.
Yes, and this was at the time this was a K-8 school, and he just expected you to use primary sources, and in fact my very first lesson with Cuisenaire rods was with John Holt. He had had one more year experience than any of us had had, and he just walked in on our first meeting of the year and gave us a real quick overview of what Cuisenaire rods could do. And let me tell you, I up to that point, I was probably the world's worst mathematician. It's like the world's worst cooks on Sunday night's HGTV. I was, as I said, I hated math. I hated anything to do with numbers. And all of a sudden, this one little short hour lesson with John Holt just opened up the world to me. And I couldn't believe what the children could do with these little centimeter blocks. I probably spent more time doing mathematics with the kids than anything else. I mean, we were following a pretty rigid reading curriculum at the time, but thank goodness I didn't have to teach it. They had special reading teachers doing it. But I had my freedom to do math, and it was just an incredible experience. And then, of course, after that, for my first year at the Hawkins School, in walks David Page from the University of Illinois, asking for the person who knew the least about mathematics to be sent to his summer workshop. And I got picked, only I didn't know that was why I was picked. But
It's too bad I wasn't in that group with you. I would have competed for that position.
I'm gonna change the film.
Okay.
okay, but it was really funny because,
I'll hold your thought, please.
okay.